Learn Chinese by playing Mahjong. You only need a handful of words to get started, and playing is both great fun and good for your Chinese. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about learning Chinese by playing games, and more specifically, we're going to talk about the most widely played game in the Chinese-speaking world, which is Mahjong, or Mahjong, or however you want to pronounce it in English. This is a podcast for learners of Chinese, so I'm going to stick with Mahjong, which is the pronunciation in Mandarin. One of the most important pieces of advice I have for beginner students, and well, actually for any student, is to try to find ways of learning Chinese that you enjoy. And if you enjoy playing games and you can find ways of learning Chinese by playing games, that's great. Learning Chinese by playing Mahjong is suitable for all levels of learners, so from beginner up to advanced, but of course for different reasons. If you're a beginner, this is a great way of learning to use the numbers, for example, and some other very common words. And not just learning them in the sense that you memorize how to say 7 in Chinese and things like that, but actually using the numbers for something practical, such as playing the game in this case. And of course, games are a great way of repeating something over and over without it becoming too boring. If you're a more advanced student, I also think that Mahjong can be useful as a gateway to Chinese culture, and it's also a great way of socializing with Chinese people. Most people don't expect you to know the game, or definitely don't expect you to play it well, so if you can do either of those two, they will usually be quite impressed. This goes for other classical Chinese board games as well, such as xiangqi or Chinese chess, and also for weiqi, which is usually known by its Japanese name in English. Go or go, as most English speakers say. This episode is of course about Mahjong, but I will probably do something with the other games later as well. But Mahjong is the game here that has the most Chinese language in it, and so it's more suitable for, say, teaching or learning Chinese. While you can use any game to learn Chinese, because you talk about the game, you need to learn the rules and so on, Mahjong actually contains a lot of characters on the tiles, for example, and it's also pretty basic. If you compare this with xiangqi, which does have characters in it as well, but not as many, or weiqi, which only has black and white stones, so no characters in sight. So let's start with the basics here, and I think you don't really need to know any Chinese to be able to play Mahjong in Chinese. Well, you do need to learn a few dozen words, but most of those are super high frequency words, such as the numbers 1 through 9, for example, which you need to learn anyway. This is of course why I sometimes use Mahjong and other games to let students practice the numbers and repeat them over and over in a meaningful context. I have played Mahjong in Chinese with people who don't speak a single word of Chinese, and that usually works quite well if you have a cheat sheet. Obviously, you won't learn accurate pronunciation simply by hearing the words a few times, but it's still possible to play. So I will not explain the exact rules of how the game is played, because this varies a lot by region, and it might even differ between different groups of people, but I will give you the general idea so you know how the game is played. And the easiest way of thinking of Mahjong is as a card game, and it originally was a card game, so it makes even more sense if you think of it like that. So when playing, you start with a hand, and then you also have a pile of cards that you draw from, even though they are not cards but tiles instead, and they are not arranged in a big pile but rather as a wall. But you can think of it exactly as a pile of cards. So when it's your turn, you draw one tile, and then you also discard one tile. So in this manner, you will be able to upgrade your hand and make it better and better. And a good hand here is one that contains lots of combinations of specific sets of tiles. And they are usually 3 of the same, or 4 of the same sometimes. And you can also have straights consisting of 3 consecutive tiles in a specific series. And essentially, the person who is able to combine all their tiles in their hand into specific sets wins the game. This is about how specific I can get without starting describing different variants of Mahjong, because there are a lot of them. Some of these differences are things that really matter for the game as a game, such as how many tiles you start with on your hand, what sets are allowed, and things like that. And many other things are purely cosmetic, meaning that they have no real influence on how the game is played, such as specifically where on the wall you're supposed to draw certain tiles and things like that. Well, it changes the random seed you have when you play the game, but it doesn't really influence how the strategy works or anything like that. And there are a lot of these etiquette rules that you don't really need to play the game as a game, but since it is a cultural phenomenon and something that people are used to, this is still wise to pay attention to and learn. So my suggestion here is that when you play with Chinese people, obviously you need them to explain how the game works to you, and that is probably something you need to do even if you know how to play the game really well. One thing you definitely have to check if you care about playing the game well is how scoring works, and this can be very complicated in some versions of the game and not so complicated in others. Some people also play Mahjong for money as a way of gambling, but this is of course not something that I'm recommending here, and if you're using it as a learner, that is probably a very bad idea. It's also good to know that Mahjong and gambling are connected in the minds of some Chinese people, so if you say that you're playing Mahjong, some people are surprised. For example, if I play Mahjong in class, some Chinese people might think that's weird because they can't associate language learning and gambling. But of course, it's perfectly possible to play Mahjong without money. It's not like poker, because in many variants of poker you actually have to have some kind of stakes, because otherwise you can't bluff, for example. If nobody cares if they win or lose, you can never bluff and the game becomes very strange. And betting, for example, is a central aspect of poker, but it is not in Mahjong. You can equally well use points and the game will work exactly as it does with money. Then maybe after you finish playing, your Chinese friends might exchange their points for money, but this is not something you necessarily will know about, and I have suspected that this is the case with several people I've played with, but I've never really asked. If you want detailed descriptions of how to play the game, and remember that you have to be a little bit mindful of which variant of the game it is, the best way is to check videos, I think. I mean, describing the rules of a board game on an audio-only channel, such as here, is not very ideal. But I have included links to YouTube videos that do introduce the rules in the article on Hacking Chinese, and of course I will put links in the description of this episode as well. One little personal anecdote I'd like to add here when it comes to scoring is that Mahjong was actually a big craze in Sweden in the 80s, and I'm born in 1984. So my parents actually introduced me to Mahjong when I was a kid, and then later I learned it again when I started learning Chinese. I remember specifically that the scoring system that people used in Sweden was super complicated and didn't really add anything to the game at all. And subsequently I've learned much better scoring systems which make the game both easier to play and better. One key difference, and I mention this because some of you might have learned similar rules, is that everybody's hands were scored based on how good they were at the end of the game. So it didn't really matter who won or who gave the winning tile to the winning player, everybody scored their hands. And this is a horrible way if you want to play a competitive or at least mildly interesting game, because one of the key interesting bits in Mahjong is balancing the risk of giving the winner the winning tile, which will cost you a lot of points, and of course trying to win yourself. And if everybody scores all the time, regardless if you actually win, and it doesn't really matter who gives the winning tile to the winning player, well, all this falls flat. So before we go through some of the key vocabulary you need to play Mahjong, I want to say that there are also solitaire versions of Mahjong, and you've probably seen apps for this, or at least I've seen tons of ads for apps like these. And these are nothing more than matching games. They have nothing to do with the game that I've described, except that they use the same tiles. They could equally well have been pictures of birds or balloons or castles or something else, it doesn't really matter, because these are obviously not very good for learning Chinese. Okay, so let's have a look at the words you need to play Mahjong in Chinese. And in the article on Hacking Chinese, I have a picture showing all the major tiles in the game, and you can check that if you want to know what I'm talking about. So first, what we have are the numbers 1 through 9, and I'm not going to read them off here. I count on 99% of the listeners knowing this already, or you will learn it before you play Mahjong anyway. Then we have a bunch of phrases that are closely connected to Mahjong or to other similar games. So the first one is to xi pai, or literally to wash the tiles or cards. And this can also be used for card games, and it means to shuffle the deck, or in this case to shuffle the tiles. So this is what you do before you play each round. Next up, we have chu pai, which means to play a tile, and this can also be used in card games. Next, we have mo pai. So mo here is a verb that normally means to touch something, but it is used to draw tiles and also to draw cards in card games. It's a little bit unintuitive, so this one is good to know. Next is hula, which you say when you win, and this ends the game. The character used for hu here is the same as the one for he, as in and. And as far as I know, it's only used with this pronunciation in this specific expression. To win though, you usually have to take tiles that the other players are discarding, not just taking tiles from the wall, and there are a couple of words for this, and these are maybe the most important ones because you have to say them to interrupt play. If you don't say anything, people might keep playing and you lose your chance to get these tiles. The first one is ch, and you say this when you want to get a tile that forms a straight together with two other tiles in the same set you already have. In most versions of the game, you're only allowed to do this if the tile was discarded by the person who is immediately in front of you in the sequence of play. So in other words, if it's your turn afterwards, you can say ch, but not otherwise. The second way to claim a tile is to say peng, and this peng is the same verb as to touch something, and it's used when you have two identical tiles and you want to take the third tile in the set. Finally, we have gang, which is something you say when you take the fourth identical tile in a set. Of course, you also need to know the names of the suits. So the first one is tong, which is usually translated as circles in English. Then we have tiao, which is bamboo in English. And then finally we have wan, which is usually translated to characters in English and also has the traditional character for 1 or 10,000 on the tile itself. The other two are easy to recognize because the circles, well, they have circles on them, and the bamboo tiles also look like they have bamboo on them. If you're buying a Mahjong set in China, most of them will not have any letters or numbers of them using the Latin alphabet or Arabic numerals. So for the characters here, I mean the 1, you will have to know or learn the characters for the numbers 1 through 9. For the other suits though, it's easier because on the circles you can just count the number of circles, and the same thing goes for bamboo. The only exception is that bamboo 1 looks like a sparrow and not like bamboo at all. Then we also have a number of high-scoring tiles. For example, we have the 4 winds. So we have Dongfeng, which is eastern wind, and then we have Nanfeng, south wind. We have Xifeng, which is the western wind, and then finally Beifeng, which is the northern wind. And normally people don't say feng, so they just say the direction, so Dong, Nan, Xi, Bei, depending on which wind they are playing or talking about. Then finally we have 3 tiles that are called dragons in English. They are called green, red and white dragon, but these are not their names in Chinese, and that's not what's printed on the tiles either. So the first one is called Hongzhong, which is the red dragon, and it literally means red center, and it's easy to recognize. You have this character for zhong, and it's printed in red. Then we have Fa Cai, which is the green dragon, and it has the character for Fa, as in Fa Cai, to get rich, and it's also printed in green using the traditional character for Fa. And finally we have Bai Ban, which can sometimes be just a blank tile, nothing on it at all, and sometimes it's also a frame with nothing in it. And Bai Ban just means white board or slate. So these are all the major tiles that are being used in most competitive games. There are also a bunch of bonus tiles that are used in certain variants of the game, but usually they don't add anything other than pure luck and just increase randomness. So if I were to pick, I would never use these, but there are many people who like them. There are then 4 seasons and 4 flowers, and there is exactly only 1 of each, unlike the other tiles that always come in 4s. So the seasons you probably also know, but it's Chun, spring, Xia, summer, Qiu, autumn, and Dong, winter. The flowers are perhaps less useful to know, but they are Mei, plum blossom, Lan, orchid, Ju, chrysanthemum, and Zhu, bamboo. So now that we have the vocabulary to play the game, let's talk a little bit about what it's like to play Mahjong with native speakers. And as someone who likes games, this is something that I've done a fair amount of. One problem you will immediately notice is that people who play Mahjong often play very quickly, and they usually talk about completely unrelated things while they are playing. This is because many of the mechanical parts of the game are completely automated for them and they don't need to think about them. Maybe sometimes there's a tricky decision, they need to stop and think a little bit, but usually they are playing so fast that you don't even have a chance to follow what's going on if you're a beginner. This makes it very hard to look at a game and just follow what's going on, but if you are in the game and they know that you're new to the game, you can ask them to slow down and you can ask them to explain what's going on and so on. And obviously, if you are in the game, they have already accepted that you as a foreigner or language learner is in the game and they will hopefully be willing to make some accommodations. One such thing that I always insist on when playing this for language learning purposes is to always name the tiles that are being played. This not just reinforces the vocabulary you're learning, but it also makes sure that you're not missing something important. And remember, some things you have to call out. So if you're going to ch a tile, you need to say so aloud. And if you're going to use pong or gang, you also need to use those words to let people know that you're going to take a tile. Naturally, playing a game with a beginner like this, and especially if you're a beginner at both the language parts and the game parts, will be very slow for the experienced players, but like I said, if they have invited you to play, they are probably okay with this. And you can always withdraw from the game later and let them finish, or let somebody take your place later if you think you're taxing their patience too much. In my experience though, people are usually rather welcoming and happy to see foreigners playing Mahjong. So before we round this episode off, I'd like to say a little bit about playing Mahjong well. Because as most long-term listeners know, I like games in and of themselves, and of course this is a nice way to combine games and language learning, but I also do care about the game itself. And if you want to play with your friends, it's nice to not completely suck at the game either. So after you've familiarized yourself with the rules and how the game works, it's mostly about balancing the risk of giving good tiles to your opponents, and this becomes extremely important when you think somebody's about to win, against what tiles you need to win yourself. And so the main skill here, as in most card games, is to keep track of what the other people are doing based on what they are discarding and what's going on in the game. And this will then inform you whether or not it's too risky to discard a certain tile, if you should try to win yourself, or maybe just try to lie low and make sure you don't lose. That is indeed the most important decision in every round. Should you play with the goal of not losing, or should you play with the goal of winning? Because there are 4 players in each round and only one person will win, and that means that you are not likely to win every round, and if you think you are not going to win anyway, what you're supposed to do is to make sure you don't lose, i.e. giving the winning tile to the winning player, because that will cost you dearly. There is of course also a certain amount of woo and mysticism surrounding the game, with some people's being able to magically discern what tiles other people have and so on. But Mahjong is in effect like most other high variance games, just about statistics and being able to play slightly better than your opponents throughout the game. And a normal game consists of at least 16 rounds, and that's quite a lot. So if you are just a few % better than your opponents, you are more likely than not to come out on top after these 16 plus rounds. And this is akin to, say, poker, where it's definitely possible to do everything perfectly correctly and still lose. And a complete beginner can also win. But if you play long enough, the experienced players who do the right thing will of course win. A final tip, if you want to dip your toes into playing Mahjong with native speakers, is to use apps to practice. There are many apps out there with AI opponents that will play, well, obviously much better than most humans, and it's a lot easier to learn the game when you can play a session at your own pace, you can think about what you're doing, you can maybe even get advice from the app, depending on which one you use. These apps come and go, and I'm not going to suggest a specific one, but if you want recommendations, head over to the article on Hacking Chinese and check in the comments. And of course, if you know of an app that's great for practicing Mahjong, please also head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. With that, I wish you good luck with your Mahjong career, and I hope that you also learn a lot of Chinese along the way. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.